The thrilling story begins with a writer named Paul, who was quite famous. Paul had written several renowned novels, all of which had sold out, and he was now heading to another location where he could write the next part of a novel titled Mystery. The novel Mystery had become very popular, and its 8th part had already been published. Therefore, Paul was traveling to a snowy place where he could peacefully prepare for and write the next part of the novel. Paul quickly traveled to the location and began preparing and writing the next part of his novel. The novel featured several interesting characters, one of whom was named Mystery. All the audience had become huge fans of Paul's novel and read them meticulously, so Paul felt a bit of pressure to ensure that the next part of the novel was as perfect as the previous ones. After several days of continuous effort, Paul completed the novel and the next part, and he was now heading back to his office to submit the novel so that the next edition could be prepared and make a splash in the market. However, Paul was unaware that a blizzard was raging outside. While driving, he couldn't see anything, and suddenly, his car had an accident. Paul's condition became very critical, and he was left injured and unconscious. At that moment, another lady came to his aid, helping him and taking him to her home. In the blizzard, there was no one visible for miles, and if the lady hadn't rescued Paul, he would have frozen to death. It was later revealed that the lady's name was Annie, and she worked as a nurse. She took good care of Paul, who was severely injured. Annie already knew Paul because she had read his novels and was a big fan of his work. She mentioned that she had read all of his novels multiple times and that they were the best. Some time later, when Paul regained consciousness, he asked Annie how long he had been there. Annie informed him that he had been there for 2 days. "And you are gradually recovering." Paul asked why Annie hadn't called the police officers to come here. Annie simply replied that the phone lines were not working at all, and there was a severe blizzard outside, making it too dangerous to go out at that time. Therefore, until the storm subsides, you can rest here. However, Paul was very anxious. Annie clarified that in the accident, Paul's shoulder had been dislocated and both legs were damaged, but with gradual rest, these issues would heal. There was no need to worry because she would help him. Annie assisted Paul with everything and even helped him shave. Paul was very pleased with this care because no one had ever treated him like this, and Annie was also a big fan of his. Annie made sure not to give Paul any reason to complain and took care of all his needs. Paul was quite impressed with Annie. Meanwhile, Paul's manager was shown, who was very distressed by his absence. A few days ago, Paul had informed his manager that he had completed the next chapter and was returning home, but since then, there had been no sign of Paul. His manager suspected that something might have happened to Paul and decided to inform the police. They started searching for Paul after getting this information. Back at Annie's house, Paul was recovering quite well. After several days of rest, his recovery was progressing rapidly. One day, while taking care of Paul, Annie asked if she could read the next chapter of the novel that Paul had with him. Although Paul usually did not show such things to anyone and kept them confidential, Annie had helped him so much and had actually saved his life. Therefore, Paul decided to give her the book with the next part of the novel that had not yet been published. Annie took the book and went to read it. A few hours later, Annie returned to take care of Paul. Paul asked her how she liked the book. Annie, looking very happy, said that it was just as amazing and superb as all the novels Paul had written. However, she mentioned that she didn't understand part of the story after a certain page. Paul asked which part she found confusing. Annie explained that Paul had included some street children in the middle of the novel who were very poor, and the languages they used were of very low quality. Annie didn't like this portrayal at all. Paul then explained that he himself came from the streets and those languages are commonly spoken there. There was nothing wrong with it as it was true to their nature. For some reason, this explanation angered Annie significantly. She spilled the soup that she was holding on the bed and blamed Paul entirely for it. At this point, another personality of Annie emerged, appearing very dangerous and aggressive. There was a stark contrast between her normal personality and this other side of her, of which Annie seemed completely unaware. After a while, Annie returned to her normal self and went back to her usual demeanor. Paul was confused about what had just happened. The next day, Annie provided Paul with all the necessary things and mentioned that she had talked to the hospital. The doctors there said that he would recover after some rest. However, when Paul asked about being transferred, Annie responded that the highway was still not cleared, so he couldn't be moved yet. He had to continue resting there. Paul asked if he could at least call his family because they would be worried. Annie replied that the telephone lines were still not working and she had called the hospital using another phone line. Paul slowly started to suspect that Annie might be lying about everything. She had brought and was reading the novels that Paul had written, which showed her deep interest in them. Annie then told Paul that she had divorced her husband several years ago. And he passed away, leaving Annie completely alone. but Paul's novels provided her with support. Annie had read Paul's books and all his novels so many times that the characters were deeply embedded in her mind. One night, while Paul was sleeping in his bed, Annie appeared in front of him in a fit of rage. Annie yelled at Paul, asking why he had killed Misri. The issue was that in the novel Paul wrote, there was a character named Misri, and Paul had killed off this character in the story. Annie was very upset because she related strongly to the character of Misri. Paul tried to explain that it was just a story and he hadn't killed anyone in reality, it was merely a character in the book. However, Annie, who was extremely angry, kept insisting that Paul was not a good person but rather a murderer who had killed such a wonderful character, Misri. Paul tried to reason with Annie, but she was far from understanding. She became completely out of control and tried to hit Paul with a chair. Terrified, Paul put his hands up in defense, but Annie's attack missed and went off to the side. Annie's rage reached a peak, and she immediately decided to leave. She warned Paul not to expect anyone to come for him, as she had locked him in and had not informed anyone. She added that if something happened to her, no one would come to save him, and he would be trapped there forever. After Annie left, Paul went into a panic, trying to escape, but with stitches on his legs and body, he could barely move and was unable to get away. In immense pain, Paul lost consciousness and lay there through the night. The next morning, Annie woke Paul and put him back in bed. Paul was much weaker than before, and Annie knew that Paul wouldn't be able to escape even if he tried. Therefore, she made no extra effort to keep him locked up. Paul had started to understand Annie's behavior and how aggressive she could be, even though she outwardly appeared kind. But that was not the case at all. Annie seemed to have a multiple personality disorder, meaning that several characters lived within her and sometimes took over her behavior. Now, Annie brought the only copy of the next chapter of Paul's story to burn. She had petrol and matches with her, intending to destroy the book because she was unhappy with a part of the story. Annie loved the character Misri and did not want her to die in the story. She told Paul that he had made a mistake with the story, and since it should not be published, she needed to burn it. Paul, who had put so much effort into writing the book, begged Annie not to destroy it. He promised he would not publish it and would keep it only for himself. However, Annie was very cunning and simply said that if the book remained with him, he might remember the story and could rewrite it. Therefore, she did not want to take any chances and insisted on burning the book. She even gave Paul the choice to burn it himself or face the consequence of her pouring petrol over him and killing him. Faced with such force, Paul had no choice. To save his life, he burned the only copy of the next part of his novel. He watched in despair as his hard work went up in flames. On the other hand, Annie was quite pleased with herself. Meanwhile, outside, a helicopter full of police officers was searching for Paul, but due to the heavy snowfall, they could not find him and eventually left. Annie watched them comfortably from the window, knowing that Paul would not be easily found. Now, Annie brought a typewriter and several papers, insisting that Paul write a new story where Misri survives and nothing happens to her until the end of the story. Although Paul was ready to comply, the situation had become extremely tense. But Paul told Annie that the papers she had brought were of poor quality and that the ink would spread all over them. Annie became very angry, feeling that no matter what she did, Paul was never satisfied. Paul demonstrated practically how the ink spread and how the quality of the paper made it useless for writing. Annie, even more enraged, left Paul in the room and drove to the city to get better quality paper. Later, it was revealed that this entire plan was Paul's strategy to get Annie away from him and escape to a safer place. Paul, now in a wheelchair, was trying to move slowly towards the door, hoping to escape. However, his legs were too weak to open the door, leaving him trapped. Paul managed to get to a room filled with medicines, including painkillers, which he took with him. Soon, Paul heard the sound of Annie's car, signaling her return with the new papers. He quickly wheeled himself back to the room and sat in front of the typewriter, as Annie could harm him if she suspected anything. Annie brought the new papers, forcing Paul to rewrite the story. However, in the new version, he made sure not to kill Misri and instead wrote favorable things about her. Meanwhile, the police officers were investigating the area to find Paul. During their search, they found Paul's car, which had been severely damaged in an accident. Although they could not find Paul's body, some officers speculated that perhaps an animal had taken it or that it might be buried in the snow. They intensified their surveillance and instructed officers to conduct a thorough search. However, the head of the investigation, the police officer, while examining the car, noticed that the car had been forcibly opened from the outside, which was something an animal couldn't have done. This meant that after Paul's accident, someone had taken his body. Therefore, the senior officer began searching the surrounding areas to determine where Paul might be. Meanwhile, Paul continued to write favorable things about Misri and kept her alive in the story. Annie was thrilled when she found out, as now the character she followed in the book was alive and living a good life. Annie was so happy that she started dancing. Paul took this opportunity to suggest that they should celebrate this by having a party and enjoying dinner together. Annie agreed and began preparing dinner for the evening. Paul's plan involved using the painkillers he had collected. During dinner, as they both sat at the table with a lot of food, Paul suggested they should drink champagne to celebrate mystery survival. They both moved to drink champagne. Paul then asked Annie if they had candles, as it would create a nice atmosphere. Annie went inside to get candles, and Paul took the opportunity to mix all the painkillers into Annie's drink. Consuming such a large amount of painkillers could be lethal. When Annie returned with the candles and lit them, a candle accidentally fell, causing the champagne glass to tip over and spill the champagne. This incident thwarted Paul's plan, as now he couldn't escape from Annie. Time passed, and Paul remained trapped, finishing his book. In this book, he had to keep the character Mystery alive and treat her well until the end. One day, when Annie went to the city to get more papers, Paul saw this as an opportunity to try escaping again. He began moving forward with the help of his wheelchair. He kept a knife for his protection, hoping to defend himself if needed. He also managed to open the door with a pin, allowing him to access another room. While searching the room, Paul discovered some scrap papers with numerous cuttings on them. These documents were created by Annie and included papers about children from the hospital who had been killed. Reading newspaper headlines, Paul also learned that the police had arrested Annie multiple times as a suspect because they believed she was responsible for the deaths of the children. However, due to the lack of evidence, Annie was released. This revelation made Paul realize that Annie must have been involved in those murders, given her dangerous attitude and personality. Paul placed the books back in their place and returned to his room. While doing so, he noticed a small penguin statue falling from its place. He caught it and placed it back, as Annie considered these items valuable. Paul then planned to use the knife to kill Annie and escape that night. He hid the knife under his bed and pretended to sleep. However, that night, Annie unexpectedly came to Paul and administered a sedative injection, causing him to fall into a deep sleep and not wake up. The next morning, when Paul opened his eyes, he found himself bound, having been tied up by Annie. Annie informed Paul that she knew he had been trying to escape. She had found the pin he used to open the door and noticed the movement of the penguin statue. Annie also retrieved the knife from under the bed, which Paul had planned to use against her. Having caught Paul in his deceit, Annie prepared to punish him. She brought in various tools intended for torture to make Paul realize the gravity of his actions. Annie placed a wooden block between Paul's legs and used a hammer to break his legs, causing excruciating pain. Paul was in excruciating pain and continued to scream as Annie tortured him. Meanwhile, the senior officer continued his investigation, searching for Paul and questioning people around the area. He ended up at a nearby shop where the shopkeeper mentioned a woman who had been coming in with a lot of typing papers. The shopkeeper provided the senior officer with details about Annie. The senior officer began investigating Annie and discovered that she had multiple cases against her and suffered from a multiple personality disorder. It started to seem to the senior officer that Annie might be the one who had imprisoned Paul. He rushed to Annie's house to question her. When Annie saw the senior officer's car, she immediately injected Paul with a sedative and locked him in the basement to prevent the officer from finding out about Paul. The senior officer entered the house and checked thoroughly but found no trace of Paul. He was about to leave when he heard noises coming from the basement. The noises were Paul's cries for help. The senior officer went back into the house, opened the basement door, and found Paul in a terrible state. Paul signaled the officer to be careful. Suddenly, Annie appeared from behind and shot the senior officer, killing him instantly. Annie then approached Paul and said that both of them had to die because more people would come to investigate. However, Paul pleaded with Annie, explaining that while they might die, the character Mystery from their story must survive. He insisted that he needed to finish the story to ensure Mystery's survival. Annie agreed to this, giving Paul permission to complete the story. For a few days, Paul worked tirelessly to finish his story. He spent long hours at the typewriter, completing the manuscript in a way that was far superior to before. After days of relentless effort, he finished the book, ensuring that the character Mystery survived until the end. After completing the next part of his novel, Paul asked Annie for a cigarette and champagne, which he always enjoyed after finishing his work. Annie quickly prepared these items and brought them to him. Paul then requested some food, and while Annie went to get it, Paul seized the opportunity to act. He gathered all the pages of his manuscript and set them on fire, knowing that if he handed over the completed story to Annie, she would kill him. As the pages burned, Annie, horrified, rushed to extinguish the flames. This was Paul's chance. He grabbed the typewriter and attacked Annie with it. Paul continued to strike Annie, who was bleeding profusely and screaming in terror. Despite his effort, Annie tried to leap at Paul to kill him. Paul managed to get hold of a metal door stopper and used it to deliver multiple blows to Annie's head, causing fatal injuries. Annie eventually succumbed to her injuries and died. With Annie dead, Paul finally gained his freedom. Shortly afterward, a rescue team arrived and took him away. We then see a glimpse of the future, years later, where Paul has returned to his city. He now uses a cane to walk and has completed several novels. Remarkably, he wrote a novel that included all the events between himself and Annie, capturing the harrowing experiences he endured. The stories gained immense popularity among critics and audiences alike, leading to high sales of Paul's novels. While Paul was sitting with his manager in a hotel, he noticed someone approaching with a trolley. To his shock, it seemed like Annie was coming toward him with a sharp knife, ready to harm him. Paul was terrified at first, but then he realized that this was not Annie but a waitress who was a huge fan of his work. Since the incident, Paul's mental state had deteriorated, and he had not been able to forget those traumatic events. He saw Annie in everyone and constantly feared that she might return to kill him. Despite this, Paul made a conscious effort to move past his fears and continue with his life. And so, our adventurous story comes to an end here.